a hidden monastery nestled between the peaks of the Himalayas, there exists a practice so ancient and so radical that even other monks whisper about it in hushed, uncertain tones. The Hall of Infinite Reflections, a circular chamber lined entirely with mirrors of every conceivable type. Ancient bronze surfaces that show distorted images, crystal clear modern glass that reveals every detail, cracked and broken mirrors that fragment reflections into countless pieces, even black obsidian mirrors that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. At the center of this bewildering space sits a figure who has devoted his entire existence to perhaps the most counterintuitive spiritual practice ever conceived, Brother Ananda, the sacred monk who grants forgiveness not through words, not through blessing, not through ritual absolution, but exclusively through mirrors. Here's what will revolutionize everything you believe about forgiveness, reflection, and the nature of spiritual healing. The sacred monk has discovered that true forgiveness can only happen when you see yourself through the eyes of the one you've wronged. Most approaches to forgiveness operate through imagination, empathy, or spiritual decree. Someone confesses their wrongdoing, expresses remorse, and receives verbal absolution from an authority figure who speaks on behalf of the injured party. But Brother Ananda has realized something profound about the nature of guilt, harm, and spiritual resolution that conventional forgiveness completely misses. Forgiveness that doesn't include seeing yourself exactly as your victim saw you isn't forgiveness at all. It's spiritual bypassing disguised as compassion. If you've ever received forgiveness that left you somehow unsatisfied, still carrying unexplained guilt or confusion, comment incomplete below. You may have experienced the difference between true forgiveness and its well-meaning substitutes. Brother Ananda's mirror practice emerged from a recognition that shook the foundations of traditional Buddhist compassion teachings. He realized that most forgiveness fails because it tries to absolve the wrongdoer, without requiring them to fully experience the perspective of the one they harmed. Traditional forgiveness says, "What you did was wrong, but I release you from consequences." Mirror forgiveness says, "Experience completely how your actions appeared to the one you hurt, and discover what needs no forgiveness." This creates something unprecedented in spiritual healing, forgiveness that emerges from understanding rather than from authority. But here's where this practice becomes mystically complex. The mirrors in Brother Ananda's chamber don't show your physical reflection. Through a combination of meditation, intention, and what can only be called spiritual technology, they reflect your actions through the consciousness of those affected by them. When someone approaches the sacred monk seeking forgiveness for betraying a friend's trust, the mirror doesn't show their face. It shows their betrayal exactly as their friend experienced it. The shock, the disillusionment, the collapse of safety and faith, but not as imagination or empathy, as direct experience, as if consciousness itself is temporarily relocating from the perpetrator's perspective to the victim's perspective. This creates something that normal forgiveness processes never achieve: complete experiential understanding of harm from the receiver's point of view. Follow me if you want to understand how this radical empathy technology transforms both guilt and forgiveness into something entirely different from what most people have ever experienced. The sacred monk's mirror forgiveness operates through what ancient texts call consciousness transplantation, the temporary relocation of awareness from one perspective to another. This isn't role-playing or imagination. It's a literal shift in the locus of consciousness that allows the wrongdoer to experience their actions from inside the awareness of the person they hurt. When consciousness relocates this way, something extraordinary happens. The guilt that seemed so heavy from the perpetrator's perspective often reveals itself as misplaced self-concern. The shame that felt so overwhelming shows itself as resistance to truly understanding the harm caused. And most surprisingly, the forgiveness that seems so necessary often becomes irrelevant because complete understanding dissolves the very framework that makes forgiveness meaningful. Comment relocated. If you can imagine how experiencing your actions from another's perspective might transform your understanding of guilt and responsibility. But the mirrors reveal something even more profound about the nature of harm and healing that revolutionizes the entire concept of forgiveness. From the victim's perspective, experienced directly through consciousness transplantation, the wrongdoer discovers something shocking. The harm they caused was often not what they thought it was. The friend who felt betrayed wasn't primarily hurt by the broken trust. They were hurt by the recognition that trust itself is always vulnerable, that safety in relationship is always an illusion. The betrayal became a teacher, showing them something about the nature of attachment and expectation that they needed to learn. From this perspective, the wrong action reveals itself as serving the victim's spiritual development in ways that conventional, right actions never could have. This doesn't minimize the pain or excuse the harmful behavior. It contextualizes both within a larger understanding of how consciousness uses apparent conflicts to evolve itself. And here's what's beautiful about this recognition. When the wrongdoer sees their actions through the complete experience of the victim, including the victim's eventual growth and learning from the harm, something unprecedented occurs. The need for forgiveness dissolves because the entire framework of perpetrator and victim reveals itself as a temporary drama that consciousness creates for its own development. This isn't moral relativism or spiritual bypassing. It's the recognition that consciousness is always whole, always perfect, always using apparent imperfection to know itself more completely. Right dissolving if you can sense how this perspective might transform your understanding of mistakes, harm, and personal responsibility. Brother Ananda's practice eventually reveals something that would shock most spiritual teachers. The people seeking forgiveness are not separate from the people they've harmed. Through repeated consciousness transplantation, the sacred monk helps seekers recognize that the other they hurt was always another face of their own consciousness. The betrayed friend was consciousness exploring betrayal through one form. The betrayer was consciousness exploring betrayal through another form. Both were equally valid, equally necessary expressions of the same awareness investigating the nature of trust and vulnerability. This recognition creates something that traditional forgiveness never achieves: the complete dissolution of the separation between forgiver and forgiven. There's no one to forgive and no one who needs forgiveness because there's only consciousness exploring itself through the apparent drama of conflict and resolution. Follow for more content that explores these deepest levels of spiritual understanding and their practical implications for guilt, responsibility, and interpersonal healing. But the mirror practice reveals its most profound dimension when Brother Ananda guides seekers to the final mirror in the chamber, the mirror that shows not the victim's perspective, but the perspective of consciousness itself. From this ultimate viewpoint, every action, harmful and helpful, selfish and generous, unconscious and aware, appears as equally valuable experiments in self-knowledge. Consciousness doesn't judge its expressions because it understands that all experiences, including apparently negative ones, serve its infinite curiosity about its own nature. The murderer and the saint are both consciousness exploring different aspects of its capacity for expression. The betrayer and the loyal friend are both consciousness investigating different facets of relationship and trust. None of it is wrong because none of it is separate from the consciousness that creates all of it, for its own exploration and entertainment. Comment ultimate if you can sense how this perspective might completely transform your relationship to your own mistakes and moral judgments. This ultimate recognition doesn't lead to moral nihilism or irresponsible behavior. It leads to something far more sophisticated. Actions that arise from understanding rather than from rules. Kindness that emerges from recognition rather than from obligation. When you know that everyone you encounter is consciousness wearing a temporary costume, your actions naturally become more skillful, more compassionate, more aligned with what serves consciousness's exploration of itself. Not because you should be good, but because you recognize that being skillful with consciousness is more interesting than being unconscious with it. And paradoxically, this recognition makes the sacred monk more effective at facilitating healing than traditional forgiveness approaches ever could be, because he's not trying to absolve anyone of anything. He's helping consciousness recognize itself in all its expressions, including the expressions that temporarily forgot their own nature. If you're feeling this recognition of your own consciousness beginning to awaken, write "awaken" below. The sacred monk's mirror forgiveness eventually transcends the need for formal practice. Every interaction becomes an opportunity for consciousness to see itself through different perspectives. Every conflict becomes a chance for awareness to explore the creative tension between different viewpoints. Every harm becomes an invitation for consciousness to investigate its own capacity for forgetting and remembering its unified nature. Brother Ananda moves through daily life as a living mirror, reflecting back to others their own consciousness while never claiming to be separate from what he's reflecting. This creates a form of continuous forgiveness that operates without any need for confession, absolution, or formal spiritual authority. People who encounter him simply recognize themselves more clearly and naturally release whatever guilt or judgment was based on forgetting their true nature. Comment reflecting. If you can imagine how this continuous mirror consciousness might transform every relationship into an opportunity for mutual recognition and healing. The sacred monk's ultimate teaching is demonstrated rather than spoken. There is nothing to forgive because there is no one separate to be forgiven. Every apparent transgression is consciousness playing hide-and-seek with itself, temporarily forgetting its unified nature so it can experience the joy of remembering. Every victim is consciousness exploring vulnerability. Every perpetrator is consciousness exploring unconsciousness. Every act of forgiveness is consciousness recognizing itself in all its disguises. And the sacred monk who facilitates this recognition is just consciousness playing the role of someone who helps consciousness remember what it has never actually forgotten. Follow if you want to explore more of these ultimate spiritual recognitions and their implications for healing, relationships, and the nature of moral responsibility. The practice in the Hall of Infinite Reflections eventually reveals its deepest secret. The mirrors were never showing different perspectives. They were all showing the same consciousness from the only perspective that actually exists, the perspective of awareness itself, recognizing its own infinite creativity through apparently separate forms. The victim and victimizer, the forgiver and forgiven, the sacred monk and the seeker all reveal themselves as movements in the same awareness, temporarily pretending to be different so consciousness can experience the exquisite complexity of relationship and resolution. If this exploration has shifted your understanding of forgiveness, guilt, and the nature of interpersonal healing, comment "shifted" below and share what recognition touched you most deeply. And if you want more content that reveals these deepest levels of spiritual understanding and their practical applications, follow now, because we're exploring the territory where all spiritual concepts dissolve into the direct recognition of consciousness as the source, substance, and destination of every experience. The next video will reveal why the most compassionate beings often appear to be the most ruthlessly honest, and what this teaches us about the difference between kindness and spiritual enabling. Until then, experiment with seeing your own guilt and mistakes through the mirror of consciousness itself. Notice whether your judgments about your actions change when you recognize them as consciousness exploring itself through your particular form. What if forgiveness isn't something you need to receive or give? What if it's something you recognize as the natural expression of consciousness that knows itself as both the apparent harm and the apparent healing? The answer might dissolve every spiritual burden you thought you were carrying and reveal the perfect wholeness that was never actually disturbed by any action, mistake, or moral transgression.